Hi everybody, hope you're doing marvellously well. I'm here with these lovely gentlemen in Sweetwater Studio A. This is Sean Daly. What are you? You're the manager and head engineer, is that correct?
Chief engineer.
Chief engineer. And this is another engineer, Mr. Jason Peets. And today, these lovely fellows are going to do a free drum recording course, which is rather exciting. You're going to get to download the multi-tracks and follow along as they record drums. And we're going to be working with the rather wonderful Nick Virgilio. No, wonderful drummer who plays with Mr. Big. He knows his onions. So this is going to be a wonderful, wonderful course. It's totally for free. You can download the multi-tracks from the recording session, but also drum samples with processed and unprocessed drums. So without further ado, we'll let these lovely gentlemen take it away.
So we're out here in our live room with one of our new Ludwig kits, Maple Classics. We have the antique bronze snare drums, so technically vintage sounding drums, but they are brand new. Some cymbals that are a little, I would say, darker, but the Zildjian Fat Hats by the K line, paper thin crashes in K, and then a Sabian Artisan Ride. So chose some stuff that kind of matched this kit tonally. So a lot of the stuff that we're doing before we get into all these mics is picking a kit that would be appropriate for the style of music we were working on, or, you know, stylistically kind of figuring out what kind of vision we had. I feel like the drums, their tuning, the cymbals are probably more important than any of the stuff that we can do in the control room. If they're not going to sound good out here, they're not going to sound good in there. So spend a bunch of time making that happen. We use different muffling devices. We have some snare weight, little leather tabs and moon gels and things like that to kind of get the drums dialed in. Kick drum has a pillow in it too, so it's muffled. So, you know, making all these choices and kind of dialing in the kit before we put anything on it is a big part of our workflow here. So I just want to kind of put a lot of emphasis on how important it is to kind of get the drums sounding as good as you can before you start recording them. So I'll let Jason tell you about the close mics that we've got going on here.
Yeah, sure. So inside the kick drum, we have a Beta 52. I kind of placed it in there in the center of the kick drum shell, pointed where the beater is hitting the batter head. And then we have a United FET 47 on the outside of the kick drum towards the left. We found putting it in the center, you can get kind of this airy sound. So a little bit off. This tends to be the best sound to kind of give the kick drum some beef and some body. So that's kind of what we have going on with the kick drum. Over to the snare, just two microphones. Again, like we said, we have this Lawton snare mic. We've never used it before. It sounded quite good in there.
Awesome, yeah. I mean, yeah, that could live there for a while. I think it has some filter features, some boost, and some high-pass, low-pass things. So, yeah, we didn't even really get into it to hear the difference.
Yeah, they're both off currently. Okay. But yeah, when we threw it up, it kind of sounded pre-EQ'd, kind of like you would want a snare drum mic.
Sounded like a snare drum? So, yeah, that was good.
And the bottom is a Shure 545 reissue, which we find that it's just a more pleasant sounding 57. So anything that we would typically use a 57 on, we have now pivoted to using 545s. There's sort of a more smoothness in the presence range of a 57, which is quite pleasant.
A little less EQ on stuff, and it kind of gets us there a little quicker. So
yeah, totally. Toms, like we said, are the DPA 4011s. You typically like them placed kind of up towards the outside of the batter head, correct?
Yeah, like maybe like a quarter or a third of the way in, pointing into the drum. The more that you point it to the center of the drum, the more stick attack you get. The more that you point it to the edge, you'll get more resonance from the drum. But like I said, the reason we use these microphones is because they play really nice with all the things that are going around. It kind of allows us some flexibility that we can kind of get into some heavier EQ and things like that later on and get what we want out of it without having to commit completely when we're tracking. But that is kind of my usual rule of thumb, is kind of between about a third of the way to a quarter of the way into the drum is where I like to point the mic, and about maybe 1.5 inches, 2 inches off the rim. And it kind of gives me a nice controlled sound, and usually able to kind of work with whatever cymbal bleed happens then. So
yeah, with other tom mics that we've tried, you know, having this crash this close to a rack tom microphone, the sound of that crash would be kind of harsh and unpleasant sounding, to where when it interplays with mics like the overheads, thered be a lot of cutting you'd have to do in post. And we found with the 4011s, when this crash is hit, it sounds just as good as it does in the overheads, just quieter. So this has been our go-to tom miking setup for a while now. Moving on to our close mic cymbals. Today we chose a match pair of Virodynamic M160s. Haven't really done this a whole lot before, but I guess the idea would be to get sort of a chunky bodiness on the direct mics of these and let the overheads kind of take care of the presence.
Yeah, and I kind of gravitate towards darker close cymbal mics. I'm not a big fan of hi-hats in general, so I usually try and find a microphone that doesn't make them any brighter than they already are. So this gives me the ability to have a nice smooth response that I can then bring into the mix and use it to kind of create some stereo separation between the hat and the ride. And the ride mic, really, it's normally only going to have a place in a mix for me when I need some definition on the ride cymbal, and that gives me the ability to kind of do that without having too much bright or harsh sound coming out of the microphone. So these have been really nice. You use them on and off. We do mess with some of the DPA stuff, and what we're using for overheads also would be a really high on the list of microphones that I would put on close mic cymbals. So
yeah.
These are the Sheps CMC 6 MK4 capsule, which is the cardioid capsule. And so we have them set up as a space pair today. They are lopsided, and I think there's a lot of people that maybe might ask about why that is, why they're not sort of at the same height. And effectively what we're trying to do is get them the same physical distance from the center of the snare drum. So by putting this mic higher and that mic lower, we can kind of keep it in the place we want, but then also getting the phase relationship with the overheads to stay intact with the microphones. And by having them the same distance from the snare, the sound is arriving at the microphone at the same time, and hopefully everything is playing nicely. And so I don't think there's any real specific distance that I prefer to go to. I mean, somewhere between, I think, like 36 and 48 inches.
Yeah.
It depends on how high the cymbals are and all that stuff. So you can kind of, you can make some pretty substantial changes with your overhead miking techniques, though. We rely heavily on XY with these Sheps microphones on our day-to-day usage. I find that I get a wider stereo image. The closer I go to the kit, the bigger the kit sounds. It's really up to you to kind of figure out what works for you in our space. That kind of yields good results, but this also sounds awesome, and we were super happy with the way it sounded today. So
yeah, these Sheps microphones are extremely musical. Like you said earlier, really popular in classical recording. And they do great with cymbals and an overall picture of the drum kit, either an XY or space pair. They're pretty fantastic. I guess moving on to our first set of close rooms, we have our off-axis microphones and our on-axis, similar setups. Two R88s, one's the active version, one's the passive version. And then C12s on the on-axis and 251s on the off-axis. Similar sounding mics. They both kind of achieve that big sound, very bright and have lots of low end.
And to just touch on the on-axis, off-axis. So if I'm sitting behind the drum kit and we're looking straight in front of it, that's what we're calling on-axis. So straight out from the kick drum is going to be our on-axis pairs. And as we're going through sounds, sometimes we can look at the stereo image of the kit, and the stuff on the left side of the kit here might have more snare drum, so it might be pulling more to that side. This is our on-axis line of room microphones. Now, this line here is our off-axis line. What ends up happening there is we're actually splitting the kit kind of down the middle on a sideways 45-degree angle, and so the toms now get more of a stereo imaging. The kick drum kind of falls in the middle of that. So does the snare drum. So effectively, all of the drums should be sort of in a more even stereo split of those microphones. You won't get as much low end because you're not in front of the kick drum, so it might be more contained or a little bit easier to deal with. And so that yields possibly more stereo results that kind of are more usable. This is a little bit more tricky to deal with, but both of them work quite well. And like I was saying, we interchange our techniques in this room. Depends on the style of the kit. Like if we had a drum kit that, say, had 3 rack toms and 3 floor toms and a bunch of cymbals and stuff, usually room mics in front of the kit and maybe high pass them to get rid of some of the low end inconsistencies would work better than mics on the off axis that would maybe just have a lot of ride cymbal or crash cymbal if it was a heavier sort of cymbal selection that was kind of masking some of the drum sound. So that's kind of the approach to that. And I think the other thing we can talk about here is that's where our off axis 414s are on the off axis of the kit pointing down. And so listening to those, we're probably going to have more low end on the left one and less low end on the right one because that one is closer to being in front of the kick drum. So it's kind of finding that balance. Now, the other thing too is once you get into processing room mics, high passing and low passing are sort of like really, that's a big part of sort of shaping that sound. So sometimes you can kind of alleviate some of the inconsistencies and make them sound a little more balanced with some EQ once you get into mixing.
Well, and putting the capsules closer together gets you a long way, before having to process things to try to not have it as many inconsistencies. So we're like, as these mics are spread out more, or even these are probably a better example, you're going to have a whole lot more snare drum on the left side here than on the right side. So if you put the microphones closer together, they're hopefully going to have a similar balance of the drum kit in each. So you're not going to have this sort of lean thing that you sometimes get with space pairs of microphones that are in the middle or close in front of the kit.
And it sounds remarkably wide when you do pan two microphones that are very near each other. It does create a nice stereo image. Different things to try, different things, but those are the kind of potential issues we run into sometimes when we get wider. I used to do a lot of like way out on the sides, and it would be like two completely different sounds, which wouldn't work so well as a stereo pair. So,
yeah, a lot of this is playing around with placement, and when you're listening in the control room and just figuring out what works best for that day. Things tend to change all the time.
Yeah, and so we have our pair of omnidirectional microphones that are boundary microphones as they're laying on the boundary of the floor, picking up the drum kit without any reflections. So effectively the sound is coming off of the floor but not going up to the microphone capsule. So this is literally laying right on the floor, and that gives us the opportunity to get almost like a direct but distanced sound from the room mics. And so that's kind of a cool effect to have. These microphones above it are omnidirectional as well, but they're going to be catching more of the reflection off the floor. A lot of these things, the tonality can change so much by throwing down a rug or sort of, changing your environment. So sometimes we can put gobos around the drum kit to kind of calm it down. It becomes more indirect sounding. So a lot of different variables, but so both of these are going to give us a really kind of spacious sound around this microphone. These sounded quite good. We haven't used them in a pair like this yet, and so kind of excited about hearing those for the first time. That was pretty cool.
Yeah.
And then the Earthworks, like I mentioned, Steve Albini does this a lot in a lot of his recordings. We did a record together years ago, and it's something that's pretty consistent. That pulled up kind of sounds a specific way. So it gives you an opportunity to kind of mess with a couple different things. The next couple pairs of room mics, we got these Mojave C37s here. I would say this is about 7 feet high, maybe 10 to 15 feet from the kit. So It's a pretty good distance from the kit. Not a lot of people have a room this large. So this could be something that could kind of move in. We could bring this in 6 feet, 8 feet, and it would just be more of like a direct sounding room mic, depending on your space as well. So, but this is really trying to get the distance, capture the space around the kit. And then the last thing we have are our M49s, M149s. So this is an omnidirectional pickup pattern, picking up hopefully a lot of ambience around that microphone. There's one on that side as well. And so they're effectively the same distance from the drum kit, not the same distance from the wall because our room is not square. So that's giving us a pretty ambient, bright, sort of airy sound of the room. Doesn't always work, but we kind of try and capture that. So if we want to get the biggest possible sound we can out of the space, it's there. And it doesn't always get used in the final mix, but if we want to do something that sounds more like an effect or has a really large sound of the room, that gives us that. So
yeah, and a lot of our room is treated sort of in the lower half. So once you get up about 10 or 12 feet, there's a lot of drywall and glass. So we found those spots are the most exciting for those mics. That gives it a huge, big sound. Also, a lot of low-end buildup back there, too, which can be cool with those mics.
If you can get into a corner in your room, usually there'll be some buildup. So if you have something that's sounding thin, getting closer to the wall, sometimes will yield you a little bit more of a bigger sound. And then the last thing that we have in our session is the vocal mic that we had set up from a session on the weekend. So this is just a U47 Telefunken Diamond Series reissue in here, kind of ready to go for some vocal tracking. We did not move it from when we track vocals. And so this is picking up reflections into this room behind part of a glass door. It's just something that kind of gives us possibility of some creative sounds. And, not something we do all the time, but, there's those sessions where I forget to turn the mic off from record when we're tracking vocals and the guy hits the drum and you're like, what is that amazing sound? It was the vocal mic. So we kind of throw that up and that becomes part of the sound sometimes. Doesn't always work, but those are the kind of things like trying to find ways to incorporate other microphones that are set up or things that you're doing in the studio that could possibly yield an interesting sounding microphone or track or create some sort of ambience to the kit that you can't normally get. So yeah, we'll start at the close mics. We're going to go through each one of the drums and make sure everything's functioning, sounding good before we get into the selection of room mics that we're going to track. So kick in microphone is a Beta 52, channel 1 here. So we're going to do a little bit of EQ on the way in for some of this stuff. Make it sound nice. Cutting some 350 on the EQ here on the Shelford channel. Shelford EQ on our 5088. So we're going to go through and kind of get everything working together, make sure that the drums sound good, and then we're going to start bringing in some of these room mics. So starting with the kick in, kick out is our United FET.
Yes, correct.
Cool.
Yep. United FET 47.
Checking, making sure polarity is working with all of the stuff, so things are adding together and getting louder. Okay, and then the snare mic. First time hearing this, the Lawton. Sounds pretty awesome.
Yeah, from what I understand, it's the Lawton snare mic, obviously intended for snare drums. First time hearing it.
Shure 545 reissue on the snare bottom. I like to kind of bring those up. Snare bottom, so it's not quite overpowering the top mic. And so we have the kick and snare going. From there, I like to pull up the overheads. Let's see what we've got going on. I'll monitor in mono here to check the polarity on some things. So on the console, we can switch to mono. If you have a monitor controller, going to mono, folding everything down, checking the polarity. So we lose a lot of the body in the snare drum when we flip the phase on the top and bottom mic. Same thing with the kick drum, gets a little smaller sounding, so we're in good shape with the overheads. Now we're using some Shep's CMC6 MK4s, really popular in classical music. We think they're the best sounding overheads we've ever heard, so we use them all the time. The less EQ I do to those, the better they sound, so I'm leaving those untouched. That's going to give us a really good representation of the whole drum kit. Stepping back to the direct cymbal mics, got a hat and ride. We have two biodynamic N160 ribbons, and so I'm going to solo those quickly in Pro Tools. So kind of a nice soft cymbal sound with these. I've got them high passed all the way up, and we'll actually probably thin out a bit more EQ. So I've got 220 hertz rolled off, about 10 dB. So just trying to get the definition on those cymbals.
And where are you panning these in the stereo space? Are you doing drummer's perspective or audience perspective?
So I'm a big fan of drummer's perspective. Being a drummer at some point in my life, I like to be able to hear the music and air drum and play that properly in my head. So all the stuff I do is drummer's perspective. So, and if I have a left-handed drummer, it even makes it a little bit easier that I can flip it around. But that's how we're approaching all of this. So Most of the files that you're going to see or look at, it's going to be hi-hat side, then ride side, and I like to label them like that if I can, so that it kind of differentiates which side is which. But the left side on most of the room, or on all of the room mics, will be the hi-hat side, and the right side will be the ride side. So good. Hit the toms a little bit for me. And so we have some cool mics here from our friends at DPA we've been using for the last couple of years. The 4011s, which are cardioid small diaphragm condenser microphones by DPA. And the cool thing about these microphones is that they have a linear response all the way around the capsule, so they play really nice being near cymbals and things like that. So the actual frequency response of the microphone is the same in front of it as it is to the side. It just gets quieter. So they tend to work really well, take EQ really well. When you bring them up flat, they're quite anemic sounding, but you're able to kind of sculpt them into anything that you want. So that's what we have on the rack and floor. So I've done some EQ. I'm going to pull the EQ out.
Kind of hear how boxy they sound because it is so linear. They don't come pre-EQ'd, but taking that inductor EQ really well.
Yeah, and so I am cutting at 350 on both of the drums, boosting at 60 on both of the drums, and lifting at 8K at a high frequency peak and a low frequency peak. So it can be shelf or peak on these EQs, and so we're lifting both the top and the bottom and cutting out some of the low mid. So get rid of the cardboard, and as we unmute these, yeah, so pretty happy with our close mics that we're going to then investigate a plethora of room mics with.
Before you move on to the room mics, can you speak on your philosophy with flipping the top snare mic out of phase as opposed to the bottom?
Yeah, so what I've been doing for years was listening to the phase relationship with all of the microphones and kind of going between flipping the polarity on every mic individually. Now I found that the best practice for me to keep things in phase was to have the top snare mic flip. So most people understand when you're miking a snare drum with two microphones, you'll need to have the polarity reversed on the top and bottom mic, and a lot of people just flip the phase on the bottom mic, and that is sort of like the approach that I was taught. So going into getting sounds and understanding that flipping the top mic actually yields better phase relationship with the overheads and the rest of the mics in the kit kind of allows for this to come together a lot easier. I'm spending less time chasing phase related issues with room mics and things like that by doing that specific move, and I can kind of keep everything, as long as all the wiring is correct and all the preamps are in phase, that I can keep everything in phase except the snare top microphone. So that's kind of the thing that kind of keeps all of these things working together in a way that gives me a really cohesive sound where everything is working in phase together, and hopefully getting us the best sounding drums we can get. What we tried to do, we're working with Warren on the weekend, and he has used an approach to room miking that we do sometimes, but we switch up things a lot. So we wanted to give everyone an opportunity to hear a few microphones on axis and off axis of the kit. So we have an AEA R88 straight in front of the kit, in front of the kick drum. And then we have another mic, the R88, another one of them off to the right, so that we are splitting the kit on effectively the center of where the two toms are, where you kind of get more of a natural split on the drum kit rather than being in front of the kit where you might get more snare drum on one side and the kick drum might be lopsided. So we're going to try and bring those up and level match them as best we can to give the perspective of those microphones and kind of compare the two different approaches.
is the R88 on axis, right in front of the kick drum.
So that's a pretty solid sounding image of the drum kit. We can get into some EQ. I'm gonna leave that out for now till we hear the other one. So as you're listening to these, you'll hear there's a little bit more low end on the on-axis microphone, and it's a little bit less heavy in the bottom end on the off-axis microphone, which I think we might even play with and maybe pull it over to the side a bit more.
Yeah.
Jason's gonna go move that
Over
over
to which
for
side?
us.
Towards the kick drum?
Away from the kick drum. So I wouldn't consider using these at the same time, but these are two different options to have. So the on-axis kit gives us more of a stereo image of standing in front of the drum kit. The low end is a little bit more consistent, but then when we take the off-axis one, which is looking at the drum kit on the side, we get a little bit more spread on the toms and allow for a little bit more of a natural feeling split on the drum kit. So I'm gonna leave the on-axis one up just for a minute as we pull up the next set of room mics. So the next set of room mics we're gonna pull up, we got some large diaphragm tube condensers. So we have a pair of C12s and a pair of 251s. So like pretty bright, big sounding microphones. So we have them in a near,
They're close together. The capsules are...
yeah, so there's a pair of them that are about 8 inches apart, just behind the R88s, about 1.5 feet. So a little bit further into the room, but very close. So when I pan them apart, the reason I like having them so close together is that I get the same low frequency response that's happening in the room there. So I'm gonna pull up the C12s that are on axis in front of the kit. So those compared to the R88, substantially darker. That's a ribbon mic. We're dealing with some effectively really bright tube condensers. So a different sort of airy feeling around the drum kit. So those are on axis. We're gonna pull up the 251s now.
which are off axis just behind the off axis R88, trying to show off two similar setups in different positions.
So a lot brighter than what we're dealing with the R88. So that is the 251 pair. That's the R88 that's in front of those. And then I have the C12s. And then I have the R88 in front of that. So if we're gonna blend a pair of these together, so that's the on-axis pair blended together. So the R88 and the C12s. Sounds nice. Mute those out, and then I'll pull up the off-axis one. So now, to me, these give me like a super three-dimensional picture of the drum kit as far as like a room miking situation goes. So it's not super bombastic or like big sounding, but it gives me depth to the drum kit. So I'm gonna pull the close mics back in and we'll listen to these two different sort of close room mic setups that we've got. So that's just the kit. That's the off-axis R88. Off-axis 251s. So on-axis RD8. Some C12s. And so it adds some depth to the picture of the drum kit. So both of those are super cool options. So we use those all the time we have done it in both of the different positions. And so it sort of depends on the situation, how big the drum kit is. If it's a 4-piece kit, it makes a lot more sense. If there's like 6 toms, maybe something in front of the kit catching all of that might make more sense. So we're gonna mute those out for a second, and we're gonna kind of keep moving down the line. We have a couple other variations of ways to kind of get a mid-sounding Rube mic situation going on. So what's next here?
The 414s that are off-axis, also sort of a mid-room setup. They're spaced out in an equilateral triangle to the kick drum, but again, off-axis, pointed towards the ground.
Okay, so this should get us sort of an interesting...
Yeah, there's sort of a darker sound than if you were to have them facing straight up. A little less cymbal than you would expect from a 414 or something as bright as that.
So sort of an indirect sound as well, right? So, but adds quite a bit.
Definitely more roomy sounding than our other close setups.
Yeah, and that's something that I mentioned too, is that we weren't really picking up any reflections. Most of those mics were actually just getting direct drums or like a short bounce off the floor. These are pointing directly at the floor, so the sound that's going to the capsules is actually bouncing off the floor going into the mic. So gives us a roomier sound, and actually sounds quite nice. Gives us some depth to it.
Yeah, the cymbals aren't getting too harsh, but there's still enough space there to kind of exaggerate.
Well, and then I have another set here, Earthworks that we're dealing with that are omnidirectional capsules, so the QTC 40s. And I made a record a bunch of years ago. Steve Albini came to my studio when I was back in Canada, and he does things fairly consistently on a lot of his recordings. So he did this room mic technique that I picked up from him that works when you do have a solid, like a hardwood floor or something to pick up reflections off of. So the microphones right now are laying directly on the floor, not on stands, and that's sort of functioning as a boundary microphone. So we're not getting any reflections, but we're actually just getting the depth of the space on the floor recorded. So I'm going to pull those up right now here.
They're spaced out evenly in front of the kit, about midway through the room.
And the interesting thing about that right now I'm hearing, and this is something that is kind of tricky to deal with sometimes, when you're trying to get wider sounding room mics, is that one of these has way more snare drum in it, right? So I think I would probably go out there and bring them a little closer so that we're not actually getting as much of an unbalanced sound. If we were to do the off-axis thing with these, I think we'd probably end up with a more consistent pair of microphones. So
yeah,
those are the kind of things I think that there's no super like hard fast rules about room miking for drums, but it's like getting that balance of the drum kit where you're not pulling the image all the way over. I mean, the intention for us is to try and keep the snare drum and the kick drum focused in the center of the stereo image for the drum kit. So having these microphones pull that image off to the side is not going to be very helpful for making a really big impactful drum sound. So that's kind of the move, and probably do a little bit of shifting on those and see if we can get something that's a little bit more balanced between the drums in the microphones.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, the next ones we have are some of my favorite microphones that are kind of under the radar. They're made by Electro Voice, and they've been made for many years. A 635, also known as a PL5, it is an omnidirectional dynamic microphone. And so they are above the earthworks in the room right now. And so the thing I like about these is that we have less of a phase relationship in the low end with an omnidirectional microphone, so we can kind of move it around and bring it in and out of play with the kit to create different dynamics, different balances, different amounts of room. I like to put these microphones really close to the kit sometimes and compress them with a lot of compression to kind of bring some energy, because it's not really having a huge effect on how the low frequency from the toms and the kick drums are working when I bring that in, that I can kind of get away with being a little more creative. We now have a pair of them out in the room now. Effectively, they're pretty much almost exactly above where the earthworks are. And to me, that even sounds more balanced than the earthworks. So that's a cool sound. Bring the rest of the kit in with that.
It's interesting. It's not really exaggerating too much of the kit, but it is giving a nice image and space.
So that's a pretty cool, that's a great sound to me, something that I can work with. And right now we're not processing anything, so you'll be able to hear all these on the stems that we can make downloadable. But we're going to go into doing some parallel processing and also checking out some plugins and stuff that can kind of make some of the more exciting parts of these mics come out. And I'm just going to check with our drummer here and see if we can get him to play more drums for us. So moving on from there, we have some effectively what I would call far room mics. And so Mojave Audio MA37s, which are reissues of the Sony C37A, which I think is an amazing microphone. It has a very different tonality than a lot of modern recreations of microphones. So it's got a really interesting mid-range character. And so we use this a lot on things like guitars, organ, things like that. And so we like them as room mics. We had a friend in here producing a record recently where that was his only room mics for the MA37s. It sounded amazing with some compression. So now we have the distance of these mics actually being further away. So
yeah, you can start to hear the depth in the kick drum hits,
which, depending on the tempo of the song, doesn't always work. So that's something to be aware of too, is like you can get this amazingly awesome drum sound and someone plays a really fast song and the drums and the room mics aren't really working in the tempo of the song. So understanding how that room's working in the context of whatever you're recording is also super important. You're not gonna be able to make super bombastic, huge sounding drums work in something that's like a fast punk rock song, or even some metal stuff where they wanna have these big sounding drums. If you have something that's flamming or sounding like it's actually got a lot of distance to it, it's gonna take away from the tightness of the drum performance. So sometimes even taking those mics and moving them in closer to the kit will eliminate some of the distance and sort of make them more usable in the context of whatever music you're working on. So yeah, so those are super cool. Last set of mics we have here are our Neumann M149s, and we have these set to Omnis, so they are omnidirectional pickup. They're about 10 to 12 feet above the floor of the studio at the back wall, so as far away as we can get them from the drums, spaced evenly from the drum kit. And so that's giving us this like really long, big room sound. And I'll solo the kit here. That's the close mics sound a lot closer when we introduced this last pair of room mics. So that's now in a big room.
Yeah.
So going back to something like our on-axis R88 C12, it's just adding a little bit of depth. When we bring that 149 into the mix. That's a set of drums in a room now. So, and with some compression, that can turn into something that becomes extremely bombastic and sort of this big drum sound. Once again, it's not always appropriate, but that's going to give us some options. And so we normally do like a close, mid, and far room mic setup when we're starting a project, not really knowing what everything's going to be at the end, so we can kind of get rid of or keep the different mics depending on the style of the song, the tempo of the song, or sort of how the drums need to be treated. So, and then the last thing that we're going to throw up here is the vocal mic from the session on the weekend is still in the position it was in the vocal booth. And
yeah, still patched into the vocal compressor that was being used. It's an 1176.
down here. So what I might end up doing on something like this is just putting the vocal mic into record with the drums and leaving it as is to have something that will kind of freak out with the kit.
This is something that sometimes happens on accident. You know, you accidentally have the vocal mic and record when the drum's being tracked, but you can add a cool character and depth to the drum recording. Being that it is in a different room.
With a bunch of them open, we have this like really kind of uncontrolled room sound, but with that, we can probably go back and get a lot of different things going on. So that's kind of us dialing everything in. We've kind of left everything pretty untouched. It's just pretty much preamp gain for all the room mics. We haven't high passed any of them. We haven't really done any processing to them. So that's kind of how we would get set here. The next move would be adding some processing, and then also trying to figure out how and where we'd plug in some outboard gear to make it make sense. Cool. So now we've got all of the drums recorded with way too many room mics. We're going to flip over to the console here. We're going to flip the mix analog on this console, bring all the tracks back up, and start processing them. So we have a lot of fun toys here. So we're going to plug in some gear, and we're going to do some pretty heavy-handed compression on some of these room mics and show you what you can do with some of the things we've recorded. I'm gonna get going here. I'm gonna start at the end of the console. We're gonna bring up our close room mics and kind of get a bit of a blend going. We're gonna then pull in and out some different room mics. We've got some outboard gear patched that we're gonna check out and see what we can do with it. All of it's gonna be recorded back into the session so you can download this and check it out. And so yeah, here we go.
Starting here with the direct mics.
Yeah, so a couple kick mics. So doing a little bit of EQ, not a whole lot, just cut a little bit more 350 on the kick drums, a little 700 on the snare, tighten that up a little bit. So we have our close mics, the hat and ride mics, so thinning them out again. Our overheads. So, nice balance of the drums. Not going to get too heavy-handed on anything. Sounds quite natural. We're not going to EQ or compress anything outside of our room mics now. So we're going to go through and we're going to pull a couple things up. I have it set up so that I can route the room mics to our groups here that have different compressors patched in on them so we can address some parallel compression. I also have the outputs of those groups sent to Pro Tools, so we're going to record them independently of the stereo mix, and so you'll be able to hear both the compressed sound and then the blended sound with the entire drum mix, and then we'll kind of take it from there. We can break it down and see what it can do. So I'm going to go in here and pull up a couple room mics. So we're dealing with our on-axis pair of mics here. So the R88 on-axis and the C12 on-axis. And so I'm going to route these all to some Elysia gear.
Yeah, so you've got this Expressor Neo and the envelope here in parallel. Expressor going into the envelope.
And so we're getting a little bit of really fast compression over here. Just reset this before we get into it too deep. So we're going to try and bring some energy out of these room mics. And so what I'm going to do is try and create some compression that makes them react a little bit more. So it's going to be pretty fast. It doesn't need to be a high ratio. So this has a lot of cool features on it. We have a threshold attack release and the ratio. So we can go through here and have higher compression ratios, actually negative compression ratios, which change the dynamic quite a bit. And effectively that's a limiting mode. And then there's a sidechain filter, so we can high pass the low frequency from triggering the compressor circuit, which is pretty cool. One of the neatest things that this company does is has a gain reduction limit. So I can have the compressor completely smashing the content that's coming into it, but it limits it to 2 dB of compression. I can open that up so it can compress more, which is kind of cool, but I can make the compressor kind of do whatever I want. But say if I only wanted to have 3 dB of compression, I just set the gain reduction limit to there, and it will only compress 3 dB. So that's kind of a cool thing to kind of be a safety net. Also, if you like the way it sounds, but you don't want to get it to duck the level too much, that's a super cool thing. Now, if we are compressing, say 6 dB, there's a makeup gain knob here, so we can bring that back into play. So if this is pulling everything down, we can turn it back up and kind of get that to counteract the loss of level we're going to have. And then there's a blend. So that's completely dry. That's completely wet. So I kind of want to get this to be a little more reactive. So I'm going to get into letting the compressor kind of do a little bit more of a bouncy sort of thing going on.
And what are you doing with the attack and release to kind of get that pumping, expressive sound?
So I am attacking and releasing as fast as I possibly can. So it's taking off the transient and then letting go of it really easily. If I slow down the attack, it lets the transient come through. So I kind of want to take the edge off of it and have it really kind of react as hard as I can. So that's a creative choice. If I was trying to add more punch to something, I would have a slower attack. Fast release kind of lets it kind of return to the level it was. So if we go the opposite of this and go slow and slow, the compression actually never really lets go. So we want to have some reactive compression going on here. So to me, that's kind of bringing out some energy. So we're going to start there. The next box we got is the envelope from Elysia, which is patched right after it.
In series.
And so this works as a similar to a transient shaper, so we can control the attack and sustain of the signal and choose the frequency that we want that to work on. So we can sort of extend the length of the drums and choose what frequency that accentuates. So finding one that kind of makes the kick drum sound nice. And so if we turn down the attack, we lose a lot of the intelligibility, but if I bring it up and have it at a high frequency, kind of adds a nice little air to it. Taking that in, putting it back in, taking it out.
Now by parallel processing these two sets of on-axis close rooms together, you've now created one stereo track that represents the front of the kick drum, at least in the close terms, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of a cool process signal that I can kind of deal with. Now if I pull these down and bring these back in, and I'm going to assign these C12s into this group. Unmute the drums. So, just gonna let him play again. So that's the close mics and the room mics, and then this is with the parallel processing.
It's really sort of gluing the drum sound together and adding some more excitement than we had before.
A little bit of EQ, kind of clean these up a bit. On the C12s, I cut a little bit of 6K on these and boosted a little bit of 35 Hertz just to kind of open up the bottom end. Using some of the blue silk in the console here. And then on the R88, it's kind of building up a little bit. So cut a little bit at 8K here on a shelf, cut 220, or just 200, and then I cut another little bit at 220. So got a little bit of the boxiness out of it. So now we have a little bit more of a focus sound when we bring that in. So, kind of digging what that does. That's a specific, like, there's not really any other product that I know that does that kind of stuff, that you can have that kind of flexibility in sustaining the transients and sort of changing the way that the dynamic envelope of the drums change. So those are really cool pieces of gear. We use them quite often, even when we're tracking in this format where we send to these buses and record in separately. So what you're hearing is all the raw tracks that we've recorded. So you can mess around with this stuff. We've also recorded the parallel brought back in so you can hear what we're doing. So from there, I think we're going to move on to another couple things that do some really cool, I think, effect-like processing. There's a box by Rupert Neve Designs called the Portico 2 Master Bus Processor that has maybe some more of the stereo field effect, allows for stereo widening and changing the depth of field. So I'm going to take our off-axis pair of microphones now and start working with those. So this is the R88. There's a little bit of lopsided low end, so I'm just going to high pass these guys just a little bit, probably at about 60 hertz. And then just cut a little 200 out of those. Going to use the red silk to bring a little bit of energy into those guys. Cut a little bit at 8K. So that's a little bit of processing on those. We're not hearing it through the compressor yet. Then the 251s. They're a little bit brighter, so I'm going to roll those back just a little bit on the top end. I'm going to introduce the blue silk on our console. So 350's got a little bit of boxiness to it. I'm going to just cut that a little bit, and then I'm going to open up the bottom end at 35 hertz to kind of get some open bottom, hopefully make it sound nice and big. So that's the blend of those going to the left-right bus. I'm going to pull the left-right bus down now, and we're going to pull master bus processor up. So
again, another very unique unit. There's not a lot of things that can do what it does.
So we're going to start from scratch here. So it has a few different things that are super unique to Rupert Neve Designs equipment. There is a stereo compressor here. There's a silk circuit that we can add harmonic distortion. And then there's also a limiter, so we can actually limit the signal all in this section of the compressor here. There's also this SFE section, which is the stereo field effect, so we can widen the stereo image, whether it's a frequency-dependent widening of the image or making the image feel deeper. There's some mid-side processing going on. So we like to use this on some of these closer room mics to kind of get like a hyper-realistic sort of room sound as if you were standing in front of the drum kit. So I'm going to start dialing in a few things here. I'm going to move the compressor in here and see if we can get it to start reacting. Probably a low compression ratio, 2:1. There's also a blend, so we can blend the compression in. So I'm gonna do some makeup gain as I compress it a little bit. And so the silk, the red does a high frequency saturation. The blue does a low frequency saturation. I kind of like what the red's doing.
Yeah, it's adding some excitement in the top end, a little bit of bite.
Yeah, and it sounds, you're listening in the center here, but bringing some air to the image. So So what we can do with this depth here is it's going to add some depth to the stereo image. So,
Man, that's so cool what it does to the kick drum in the room.
so that changes that aspect of it. And then I'm going to try the width here, which is going to be effectively like a stereo widener. That's with the depth and the width in now. Now, there is some EQ points here where we can focus the specific frequency range we want to affect with this. With that out, it's a broadband effect, but sometimes the width is cool if you're just doing the top end, which that is now, just the high frequency.
Yeah. The depth of the lower frequency seems nice.
It gets a little murky.
Yeah. But overall, the exaggeration you're getting out of that is a very unique sonic signature that, you know, you're not going to get with other things. Very balanced too because of the EQ you did ahead of time. We don't kind of have this lopsided low end like you were getting before.
Yeah. So let's pull the rest of the unprocessed mix back into that. So that's a pretty cool addition. So now we hear both the process and the unprocessed. So that's just without any compression. That's with compression and stereo widening. So, and then we'll creep the other drums back in.
Blend it in here.
So that's a pretty unique processor to get some really kind of different effects. It'll kind of push your imaging a little bit out wider than you would normally be able to do with a regular bus compressor. That's a VCA style compressor they have in there, and sort of like a brick wall limiter, so can be used really effectively on a stereo bus, but it also does really great processing of drums and even like individual room mics when you're tracking it. So that sees a lot of action around here, but that's a really cool thing we like messing with. I think, I don't know, pull these back in. So what we're listening to is effectively uncompressed now, and then we can open up our expressor. Which gets a little weird because we did kind of do them as comparisons. So
Yeah.
I might try doing. So now our off-axis room mics, the R88 and the 251, are going to both the expressor, the envelope, and the master bus processor separately, and we're able to blend them in. So you can actually hear that on the tracks we're recording back in off of this. With the uncompressed sound blended back in. Cool. Now, the next thing I want to pull up here is the Chandler TG1. So this unit over here that we're looking at is effectively a copy of a limiter from Abbey Road. I think TG Consoles, Dark Side of the Moon. Wade from Chandler has been making this for a long time now. It's one of my favorite compressors and does a really cool thing that I don't think much else kind of has this vibe going on, something that can be so heavy-handed. So I'm going to pull up our MA37s here and throw them into this.
Muting the direct signal.
Yep, so muted the direct signal, so now we're back over here.
I love the way those sound in that room.
It's a really natural and a very musical sounding microphone, so we're gonna destroy it though with some compression here. It's gonna be awesome. So let's see what we got going on. So the harder I drive this, the more this thing's gonna react. So that's with it turned off. That's with it engaged. So it does a really good job of like that super pumpy, sort of exciting sound. That's something that I've chased for years, and that's one of the only pieces of gear that really kind of gets me there really quickly. So there was a slower release that kind of becomes sluggish, but the faster, putting it on 1 and on limit, you get this really great sort of pumpy sort of thing going on. It also has a total harmonic distortion mode, or it has a harmonic distortion mode where you flip that in and it just turns into a distortion box. But it sounds more exciting when it's in limit. So that blended in,
It's really exaggerating the room and kind of adding a sustain to the kick and snare.
so just back to the close mics. If we open these one more time, we get like more dynamic space. It's a little livelier, but when we open up this TG1, the whole thing comes to life. So
Yeah, that's kind of adding the character you would expect from, a record or where it's, more dramatized.
and then back to our close mics, which continually sound less exciting as we bring in some of these cooler sounding room mics. So the mics that are a little bit new to us here, I'd love to hear what these things are doing. You want to mute the close mics here. So these are our 635s. So we have less bottom end buildup. There is definitely more of an airiness to these. They're omnidirectional, but they're dynamic, so they're not quite as bright. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw these things through. We have this really awesome Herchild compressor over here. So I'm going to dump these things through the Herchild and see if we can't get them doing some more cool things here. So. And I like to process room mics as much as I can individually when I'm compressing them, so I get a little bit of a push and pull. But I also kind of need to figure out to make sure that they're functioning the same way. So this changes the knee of the compression, so the compression grabs a lot sooner. So we're digging into, you know, probably 10 dB of compression here, and it's sounding pretty cool. I'm just gonna flip back here for a second. So, you know, no compression, a little bit drier sounding. When I kick those back in,
it's interesting. The TG1 was kind of making the microphone sound like they had more sustain. This is almost giving them more attack.
yeah, it's making them a little more aggressive sounding. So, bringing that up. I'm going to open up the close mics. So, sort of a variation on what we get out of the room. So we're not really getting any of the bigger bombastic things that we were getting out of the MA37s. This is more of like an ambience that's being created with it, which is pretty cool. So. So now we got the MA37s, 635s with compression blended back in. So we have a pretty exciting sounding room. Open up our other off-axis mics. End up with some really cool stuff. So, I mean, we can keep exploring this, but I think what we're really trying to show is that, you know, especially when you're kind of grabbing at getting detailed room captures of a drum recording, that a lot of this heavy-handed, you know, processing can yield some pretty extreme sounding results. And so when we're diving into it, it's really kind of stylistically, what are we going for? Is this going to have to be something that's clean and more pristine that we need to kind of work on, or is it going to be something that, like, distortion and compression and limiting are going to yield the final sound that we want? So that kind of dictates how would we approach putting these things into play and making those choices as we're engineering a session. So it's kind of been one of those things where we've been, you know, playing with different things. I mean, the TG1 has been a thing I've used for years, but it's like these Elysia pieces are new to us, and we've been using them on a bunch of stuff, and there's a ton of plugins that can get you to this place as well. So I just feel like if you're in a space, it's always worth capturing as much as you can, because closed drum mics are fairly limiting on what you can actually do with them. I mean, a kick drum's gonna sound like a kick drum, a snare drum's gonna sound like a snare drum, but the character of the room and the space that you're recording in is really gonna be what sets the recording apart, or has a really unique voice of the space that you worked in. So it kind of makes sense to try and capture that and exploit that as much as you can so that you can use that in your mixes.